Well, thank you very much. I've been invited to share ideas on global education, and to me, the question here is to see that there is a global challenge of rethinking education, both from the part of formal education and the non-formal, with this double big challenge, which is to develop fulfilled individuals and global citizens. I've done this based both on my research on World Scouting on the one hand, but also on the work that I'm doing leading a program on education change called Escola Nova 21 in Catalonia, which is trying to transform the Catalan education system towards a more active, learner-centered approach. What I want to share with you today are four big ideas. One, what is the state of the arts of education today? The second, the idea that Scouting is fundamentally focused on the empowerment of individuals for community change. Which challenges we face as education today in the world, and finally, which global citizens for which better world. Let's start from the beginning. Since the time of the Romans, we have this debate on whether education is about filling a vessel or kindling a flame. Plutarch was saying this idea that when you think in education as filling a vessel, you have the problem of thinking that the heads of the kids are empty and that you just have to put something there, and that probably the approach should be more something like kindling a flame, which is precisely an approach that in the last 100 years we have had from many educators. Now, if you see this image from the late 19th century, the idea was if education is basically filling a vessel, then probably the problem is that we are gonna just invent some kind of technique to put the books on the heads of kids without them having to do an effort. Now, this is a little bit the transformation in the 20th century. People like Montessori, the great American philosopher John Dewey, or Baden-Powell himself had been talking about this idea of education as a way to develop the potentialities that are already in kids. And this is something that goes through an active approach where kids are the protagonists of their own learning and educators are the ones who actively help them to develop them. This approach had been also being promoted by the UNESCO. In the first report that was published in 1972, directed by Edgar Faure, which said we should no longer assiduously acquire knowledge once and for all, but learn how to build up a continually evolving body of knowledge all through life. This idea of learning throughout life and to developing the capacity to learn by yourself was also focused in the second big report directed by Jacques Delors in '96, proposing these four pillars, the learning to be, learning to know, learning to do, and learning to live together. And particularly, he said, each individual should learn how to learn. So creating people that were autonomous in the process of learning. Now, these approaches that UNESCO had been saying in the last 40 years focus on the whole development of the child and the personalized learning as this active learning approach had been also expressed in the last UNESCO report. It was in 2015. It's called Rethinking Education. And one of the things that they are saying is beware, because these four pillars that the Delors report were talking about are under threat, particularly the pillars of learning to be and learning to live together. And this is because traditionally school had been focused on the learning to know, and because the pressure of job market had been focused on the learning to do. And precisely, I would say, where Scouting had been particularly strong is on these other pillars, the learning to be and the learning to live together. That's why the UNESCO report says that it had never been more urgent to rethink the purpose of learning, so what for, and the organization of the purpose of education, I'm sorry, and the organization of learning, so how learning happens. And on this, it also adds a very important idea for us, that the boundaries of education are blurring. This idea that formal education was one thing, non-formal education another thing, informal education another thing, and these things happen in separated moments and separated spaces is not true anymore. All of this is blurring, and precisely for that, we have to rethink what are we generating with our educational action. Now, on this, it's important to understand a big change that happened during the 90s on the concept of which kind of learning goals school have. And it's the idea of competencies. Now, with competencies, the world of the Anglo-Saxon speaking world has a problem, because the term competencies in English has two different meanings. One meaning is perfectly equivalent to skills. Skills are the abilities that we have to do something. The other term, which is the one that is centrally used in education, is the one that refers to the ability of articulate all knowledge to be able to respond to real situations. Now, look at this, because that means that the information that we memorize, the understanding that we should understand, the skill that we have to practice to acquire, and the attitudes and values that we have to live, all these elements should be articulated in a way that could develop competencies. When I studied English when I was a kid, in my school, we memorized vocabulary, we mechanized verbs, we practiced pronunciation, and we developed some attitudes like being able to overcome failure when you speak. But the first time that I was in an international event, I was 23, and it was the European Guide and Scout conference. I was totally unable to speak or to understand English. And that's why I used the translation in French that was closer to Catalan, and at least I understood the vocabulary and the main ideas. Now, how come I developed the competencies? Because being international commissioner, which I was the year later, you need to communicate with the others. So I needed real situations to develop those competencies and to be able to express myself and to understand in English. So when we talk about competencies, we talk about this in all ways, in all areas of our life. We also have to reflect on how we learn. And on this, in the last 20 years, it had been a big change, particularly because the knowledge on how people learn had been evolving. And in 2010, a big summary of the OECD explained that in this document called The Nature of Learning, with these 7 principles. The first, learners should be at the center of the learning process. The second, learning is a process of social nature. It means cooperative, mostly. Third, emotions and motivations are an integral part of learning. The fourth element is that learning must take individual differences into account. The fifth is that challenge and effort are key in learning, but not overload, not boringness, not fear. It should be linked with this idea of emotions and motivations. 6, formative feedback and clarity of expectations favor learning, to understand where you have to go and how come you are not learning what you are supposed to. And 7th, learning promotes creating horizontal connections among disciplines and languages, among spaces of learning. That 7 principles of learning are fundamental not only for school, are fundamental for any learning experience, and you could recognize them in the approach that Scouting has to learning. But not only this, in 2015 also it was the year that the World Education Forum was organized by the UNESCO and the United Nations system, and they redefine what quality education is in the Incheon Declaration, which it says it's not only focused on the acquisition of the fundamental competencies of literacy and numeracy, but also on analytical, problem-solving, other high-level competencies, interpersonal, social. But it also says it develops the competences and enables citizens to lead healthy and fulfilled life, make informed decisions, respond to local and global challenges, etc. All of this is linked with a much wider idea of what education is. And it touches directly to our logic of what Scouting is doing and what school is doing to achieve this idea of quality education for all. And here is where, to me, Scouting comes. It's very important to understand that our approach on what education is in Scouting comes from two fundamental ideas. The first idea is the equal dignity of all human beings. That is why we say that Scouting, the Scout is brother or sister of all other Scouts. This idea of equal dignity is on the base of all the educational action of Scouting. And the second one is the unique potentialities that each human being has. We believe in the potentialities of each one of the kids, besides also recognizing their equal dignity. And this is a huge and very important base on what education means for Scouting. And linked to this, there's the idea of the purpose of the movement. And the purpose of the Scout movement is to contribute to the self-development of young people in achieving their potentials as individuals and as responsible citizens. Those two levels, individuals, citizens, self-development of young people, is the logic that Scouting should have when reflecting about education and when reflecting about what's its role today when school is trying to move towards more active learning. Now, that means also that, as the purpose shows, the direct aim of Scouting is education, whereas creating a better world is a consequence of this education. And we do this through learning experiences for youth empowerment. The interesting thing also is that Scouting creates or develops these learning experiences in a context of shared values, inclusive values of living together. And this social code, which is the Scout Law and its free adoption, is precisely the way that we have to create individuals with inclusive values for them to be able to develop this better world. That means that the Scouting approach to education is linked to the idea that young people take responsibilities, become protagonists of their process of development, in dialogue with adults, not in vertical obedience, having meaningful life experiences in cooperation with the others. And to me, this is a good expression of what being empowered means. This idea, as BP drew it, of being able to do whatever they feel that they could do with their lives and with the transformation of society. Now, when we think about the Scout method, we have to think precisely in that way, how the method is composed by means to get to this end of the full empowerment of young people through meaningful life experiences. And we have values and motivation to grow. This is the principles and commitment to them. Experiential education, which is the learning by doing. Protagonists of their own growth, which is the personal progression. Peer education, this is the meaning of the team system. Adults as facilitators in dialogue, which is the adult support. Identity and belonging, which is the symbolic framework. And challenge environmental awareness and inner life linked to nature. And finally, citizenship, this local and global at the same time, which is the community involvement point. All of these articulated is what gives these meaningful life experiences for the empowerment of young people. The confusion between means and ends, it's a particular problem for the movement. And this is why I think that we should enter into this logic of that scouting is what we do not see. Badges are means to stimulate plural progression. Woodcrafts are means to develop efforts and skills. Uniforms are means to be identified with the group. Ceremonies are means to solemnize key moments. And in the World Scout Education Congress last year, I shared this idea that when Baden-Powell wrote Scouting for Boys, he was expressing how scouts were and how they dressed, thinking basically in something that didn't exist. Because when he wrote that, scouts, as we know today, didn't exist. And maybe Baden-Powell could have imagined in a funny day writing Scouting for Boys saying, the scouts always dress like Native Americans with the feathers and stuff. And now we would have those many people in scouting saying, oh, if you don't have feather, you are not a proper scout. So again, if we remember that those are means and not ends, that help us to know that means should be readapted with time precisely to be valid to reach our educational ends. And when you have a doubt, remember BP, ask the boy, ask the girl, the answer is there, they are the main protagonist. A research that was published in '97 called by WOSM called The Educational Impact of Scouting explains precisely this idea that the strength of scouting is in the experiences that kids have when they are in the scout group and the meaning that they make. So it's the life experiences that we provide in this environment of confidence and trust where they could develop all their potentials that give them the possibility precisely to develop those values and this empowerment. The role of educators is precisely, says the research, that respect and trust that the leaders create and the dialogue with young peoples that create the conditions for this empowerment to happen. So it's important to think this because we could see that the power of our educational activities is stronger than we could imagine. And it's not far away from what Mitch Resnick, the MIT professor, creator of Scratch and leader of the research group Lifelong Kindergarten expresses. He says, in all the life of a person, learning happens basically, he says, based on these 4 P's. Projects, something that is meaningful. Passion, something that connects with your emotion. Play, something that you could experience, try, test, and learn from the failure. And peers, so interaction with the others. And he says, this could go from kindergarten to university, and I would say this is precisely what we have in scouting as well. Which are the challenges that we face when talking about education today? Well, a big transformation in the world, starting precisely with the idea of the digital transformation that is transforming the way we interact, the way we learn, the way we work, the way we get informed, the way we take decisions, and probably in a big way, the way we understand our lives in the next decades. But also we have the huge challenge of climate change. The consequence of this climate change precisely on the big natural catastrophes that are creating also gigantic migrations with contradictions like we have with the with how to solve the problem of refugees, the shameful way the European Union is managing this and the European Union countries. The contradiction also in societies that are more and more multicultural. This is France. In the 60s, the police would go to the woman in bikini calculating whether she had the right centimeters to be on the beach. a couple of years ago, the police were going to calculate if the burkini was too long for them to be accepted. This is part of this puzzle on trying to solve the questions of multiculturalism. The terrible increase of xenophobia, populism, anti-immigration movements, the terrible situation that not only racism, but racially discriminations are still in countries like the United States or Brazil, where you have 7 more times possibilities to be killed by police if you are black than if you are not. The terrible pandemia of aggressions against women all over the world, but also the hope of young people being articulated, being empowered, and standing for a change. In all these contexts, the question related with the job market is important as well. A couple of years ago, the World Economic Forum was explaining that around 65% of children today in primary education are going to work in jobs that still don't exist. And particularly, they express this idea that the top skills that are going to be most needed in 2020 are being changed just in 5 years. Look at the first 5 or 6: complex problem solving, critical thinking, creativity, people management, coordinating with others, emotional intelligence, judgment and decision making, service orientation, negotiation, cognitive flexibility. And think, where have you developed these skills or acquired these skills in your life? Had it been in formal education? Had it been in experiences like the ones you had in scouting? The big problem precisely with what is needed in this kind of world is that, first of all, those skills are very difficult to measure with traditional evaluation systems of formal education. But the second one is that the potential that movements like Scouting have on developing them to empower young people to answer the needs of society today are precisely because it's close of the living experiences and the life experiences that we're developing in the movement. But when talking about empowerment, it's not only about this kind of needs. It's also about the empowerment of each one of people. And particularly essential to that is the one that affects 50% of world population, which is the gender. This research published in Science on January 2017 explains precisely how when kids are 4 or 5 years old and you ask them about who is for them a very, very smart person, they identify either with a boy or with a girl. But when they are 6, more than 80% of them identify a very, very smart person with a boy, which means that when we grow up, boys think that we are smarter than we are. Girls think that they are less smart than they are, and we feel normal that in positions when smart people are needed, you have more men than women. And this starts precisely in an early stage, such as 6. And it's not, this is totally linked with this idea of empowerment, on how we are providing something for kids to have better lives and to contribute better to society. Big global challenges are trying to be addressed from 2015 through the Sustainable Development Goals. Those are the big global agenda established by the United Nations, adopted by the General Assembly. And the idea is that each one of those elements are interrelated, and all of them could come from the local to the global in a way that could transform societies. And the SDG 4 has a specific talk about how education is key, not just for those goals as public policy goals to be achieved through public policy decisions or government, civil society, or companies' decisions, but also how shaping global citizens is key to achieve those goals. And it talks precisely about this idea of competencies to promote sustainable development, human rights, gender equality, culture of peace, nonviolence, global citizenship, cultural diversity. On this, both formal and non-formal education have huge responsibility. And I would say that for us, it's important to understand that what we are doing related with global citizenship is totally linked with what the SDGs are saying. Now, when we are talking about better world and global citizenship in scouting, what are we talking about? We were saying before that the goal of scouting is this empowerment of each girl, each boy, and not the direct transformation of society, which means that scouting does not attempt to establish a particular vision on how society should be, but to shape empowered individuals, responsible citizens with inclusive values, for each of them to participate in the definition of their model of society and to contribute to make it possible. This logic is very important because it means that we should create situations for them to be able to define their model of society and not for being taught which model of society they should work for. How could you do this in a world of post-truth and fake news, in a world of growing populism, in a world of xenophobia and racism or fundamentalism, which are trends that we are seeing today in Europe that are incredibly worrying and that affect our vision of citizenship? Well, this had been somehow linked of what people like George Orwell said in the 40s when he said, if we don't know, if in the post-truth that we call today, in the fake news world, we cannot say what is fascism and what is not, then we get in this political quietism that blocks us to be able to respond and to fight against fascism. A few weeks ago in Berlin, it was a demonstration of an ultra-right movement that was surrounded by 4 times more people of the anti-fascist groups. And the ones of the ultra-rights were shouting to the ones that were protesting against the fascists, saying, "You fascists, you don't want us to demonstrate." Well, if fascists accuse the other of fascism, then how come you could articulate what is fascism to fight against it? It's the same of what Oscar Wilde was saying when stating that for many people, the opinions of the others are their opinions. So they don't have opinions by themselves, which is something that we should avoid in scouting precisely to our kids. And finally, the idea that Amartya Sen is saying that the responsibilities of choice and reasoning are central to the development of free people that are able to take decisions in their lives. This idea of choice and reasoning, he says, when in the identities world, we are entering into a logic that you cannot choose your identity. You cannot choose whether if you have born in Catholic country and you're a Muslim and your family name is different, and they say, oh, you have to decide which is your identity, you cannot be blurring, then he says we damage our ability to defeat violence. And in this context, it's important to understand that we are in a movement that mostly deal with identities, because citizenship implies dealing with identities. And in scouting, this dealing with multiple identities could also mitigate their excesses if we do a good focus. First, because competing identities can challenge the exclusionary vision of an identity. And the Scout identity, being global identity, does so because it balances the others. You are Catalan, you are Catholic, you are more traditionalist, but you belong to a movement, and this movement has values that make you to accept the other, even if the other has a different faith, has a different color, has a different cultural identity. I remember a nice article by Baden-Powell of 1936, about scouting in South Africa, saying, I believe that the development of scouting in South Africa is gonna lead someday to a situation where a South African society understands that all humans are equals. That was decades before, many decades before the apartheid ended in South Africa. But the other element that is important is to understand that it is precisely because this need of limiting the tendency of exclusion of the identities, this is the reason why the scout groups need the global belonging. To mitigate this exclusionary tendency of identities and to fully educate in global citizenship. So it's not only because the groups could go to jamborees or to do some kind of international activities, it's because we play with identities and we are responsible for displaying with identities to be always in the framework of the recognition of the identity of the other, of the dignity of the other's identity. There is a double logic of scouting that we don't think so much about, which is the logic of scouting as a movement and scouting as an organization. In general, when scouting plays as an organization, like your organization, like the Romanian Association, the Scout Association, the World Organization of the Scout Movement, in general, does not clash with prevailing social values. Or institutions. On the contrary, it supports them. That is why in many countries you have the king or the president as honorary president of the Scout Association, and we interact with the mayor, interact with the minister. But as a voluntary movement composed by individuals who shared voluntarily values, those inclusive values of coexistence, it's as a voluntary movement that scouting is a source of critical individuals committed to make a change based on those inclusive values that they share, and challenging, therefore, unfairness and oppression in many different ways. For instance, racial segregation, xenophobia, religious hate, discrimination by origin, migration, refugees, socioeconomic inequality, authoritarianism, violation of human rights, gender inequality, violence, homophobic discrimination. Each one of these elements had been challenged by individuals, and somehow they have forced these scout organizations to be able to be also, as civil society actors, instruments for social improvement. The good news is that the research that was done in '97 on the educational impact of scouting talks about this. It says that young scouts unconsciously distinguish between their inclusive scout values and the exclusionary values that they face in their day-to-day. Not only in a theoretical point of view, but also in the practice that says the adolescents critically strike the coherence of the suggested values with the practices, including with this incoherence is of the scout leader. So we are shaping people that are able to understand the difference between the values when are inclusive or the actions where they are exclusionary. And this is a very strong power that we have to be aware of in front of the situation where we live. Precisely because the way that we have to fight against this post-truth and fake news is this self-reflection and resilience. The way we have to fight against populism is critical thinking and agency of kids. The way that we have to fight against xenophobia and racism are the inclusive values that we share. The way we have to fight against fundamentalism is to promote individual judgment of each one of our boys and girls. I was talking about the SDG before, and to me they are a unique reference to scouting for its community involvement and the Better World framework, because they create empowering citizenship experiences beyond cultural relativism. So you can no longer say, oh, you know, gender equality, this maybe in this European society could happen, but in our society, clearly boys and girls should be in a different level of acceptance. There is no cultural relativism with the 17 goals of the SDG. And also, they are particularly important for us because they are not only a good framework for our community involvement activities, but also because they make those activities local and global at the same time. So when you do an action that is linked with your time, with your neighborhood, it's something that impacts to the global, and that makes kids to understand that the global is not an abstraction, it's the sum of those local and national actions. And there is this document published by UNESCO recently, last year, Education for Sustainable Development Goal Learning Objectives, that precisely talks about this. For instance, in the SDG 16, it talks about which kind of outcomes the learner should have. For instance, the learner is able to critically assess issues of peace, justice, inclusion, and strong institutions in the region, nationally and globally. The learner is able to publicly demand and support the development of policies promoting peace, justice, inclusion, and strong institutions. The learning is able to collaborate with groups that are currently experiencing injustice and or conflicts. The learner is able to become an agent of change in local decision making, speaking up against injustice. Those learning objectives are super strong and give us a great framework of what it means to be a global citizen today for us and for all the education systems. But at the same time, the SDGs should be for us a great partnership and something that we could go beyond. Because certainly the great potentialities of the SDG is that they are a consensual framework for what global citizen means, global citizenship. But at the same time, we should be aware of their limitations. They should not restrict our young people's better world perspective, because the better world imagined should go much more beyond of what the SDG are today. They are already gigantic, but we are dreaming in something much bigger. For instance, the 2016 report on trafficking in persons by UNESCO, explaining that this traffic goes from child soldiers, sexual exploitation, forced marriage, selling children, removal of organs, forced labor. Last spring, I was invited by Escoteiros do Brasil to visit their actions in the Amazonas, in the area that is in the border with Peru and Colombia. It's a very poor area. And in that area, because the river is so big, it's impossible to control the traffic of drugs and the traffic of children for sexual exploitation, for traffic of organs, and in some cases directly for work slave. Now, the situation of hopelessness that they could live, it's totally linked with the potential that Scouting could have, could do there, and is doing there on empowering these kids. But when we talk about all of this, we talk also about data like the trafficking, the particular traffic for sexual exploitation. The calculus of equality now is that it creates around $99 billion a year, the market of sexual exploitation. How do we deal with this? How do we deal with this, knowing that in our towns you have houses of prostitution that are clients or part of this big market, or the pornography that we have in the internet that is linked to this? How could we deal with this if it's something that is not directly linked with elements that are on the SDG, or something that is even more controversial and more complicated? You might remember Alan Kurdi, one of the hundreds of kids that had been killed, or thousands of kids that had been killed in the Mediterranean when trying to escape poverty from North Africa. Since the death of this kid in this period, around more than 8,000 people had been killed or had been sunk in the Mediterranean. In images like this one, with hundreds of people sinking, probably many of them had been scouts in their communities. What should we do? 2 months ago, Catalan NGO that is working precisely on saving these immigrants to sing and to die, were the ship that they used was taken in Italy because they were accused to go to help illegal immigration. What should we do here? European authorities, in this case Italian, had a point. They said, oh, this could be a way to facilitate illegal immigration. But what is the alternative? To let them die in the Mediterranean. When I'm talking about thinking beyond the SDG, this is what I mean. There are things that will never have institutional answers. And that's why we need empowered citizens, individuals with these values of living together, these inclusive values that are able to answer all these elements. And to me, it's precisely to empower individuals with inclusive values, individual judgment, critical thinking, and agency, which is the opposite to indoctrination, the main tool that we have to transform through education how society is. Responsible and committed citizens acting accordingly with their values. And it's quite linked of what UNESCO said in this 2017 report on preventing violent extremism through education. It says, we should develop in young people capacity to think critically, to learn by inquiry, and to verify facts so that they do not fall prey to the simplistic and one-dimensional views of the world. Now, inclusive values, judgment, critical thinking, and agency. This is, to me, the empowering cocktail for the scouts to be change makers. And if we use this cocktail, we could reach this goal of having fulfilled individuals, educated in love in place of fear, as Baden-Powell said, as responsible citizens, committed to create a better world, equipped with life competencies and open minds to make their vision possible. And this is all. Thank you very much.